Well, good morning, everyone. And before I start, this is officially the biggest conference the SRA have ever run. Thank you, Helen. So I'm David Johnson. I'm the chair of the SRA, and welcome to our 40th anniversary conference in our new swanky venue. I hope you're enjoying everything the venue has to offer. It is an important, as I say, an important year for us because the SRA is 40, and gathering people together who work right across the social research profession to allow people time and space to hear about how the discipline is developing and to meet old friends, make some new acquaintances, we think is an important investment as a board of trustees. What is interesting in the audience that you've got, if you look around, we have a full auditorium, but about half of you are not members of the SRA. So you're especially welcome because you have every opportunity to join the SRA and mean that we have an even bigger conference next year. But in all seriousness, we have a wide range of people with from very diverse backgrounds. So do meet and greet, make new connections, and really enjoy the day. I've got one request and then an introduction, and then that's it from me. So can you just all make sure that you check your phones to make sure that they are on silent? When I was standing up here, I couldn't get any service anyway, so it's not going to ruin your life to have your phone turned on to silent just for a little bit, so that would be fabulous. My second duty is to introduce Bev Bishop, who will be chairing us for the day. So Bev is the Joint Head of Profession for Social Research at the Health and Safety Executive. And Bev is going to introduce our various speakers and help us navigate our way as we go through the conference. Thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, David, and welcome everyone. We've got an excellent day planned. We've got an excellent range of speakers with a vast range of experience and expertise, covering topics ranging from in-the-moment research to the challenges and opportunities offered by new technology, the involvement of research participants in research outputs, and cutting-edge developments on impact evaluation and survey methodology. We've also got 3 fantastic masterclasses on semiotics, infographics, and qualitative research. And of course, we've also got an excellent range of delegates, and as David said, please do take the opportunity to chat with each other and network during the breaks. I'd like to start by thanking all our conference sponsors, Sage Publishers, the main sponsor, Guide, the online survey firm, NCRM from the University of Southampton, Policy Press, who will be launching a book today, more of that later, Max QDA, the quality software specialists, Quirkos, other quality software specialists, and the Health Foundation, who are research funders. All of these have stands in the gallery space, so please do visit them during the breaks. An excellent reason to visit is also the prize draw. If you get your flyer stamped at every stand, then you can win prizes, all of which are research-relevant prizes. Many thanks to the SRA Events Group's volunteers who've devised the conference. That's Jane Barrett, Debbie Chan, Sarah Cheeseborough, Natalie Lowe, and Caroline Smith, and of course the inimitable Graham Farrant and Monica Wright. And of course, thanks to all today's speakers for giving their time and expertise. As you've no doubt noticed, we are in a new and rather fabulous venue, which stretches over 3 floors. So please do check the map in page 4 of the programme to make sure you know what room you're going to. Housekeeping. No fire alarm test is planned today, so if you hear the alarm, go up the stairs, follow the fire marshals, and out of the building via any fire exit. We've asked you to turn your phones to silence, but please do feel free to tweet. Tweeting is very much encouraged. Our social media reporter, Annika Coughlin, will be tweeting and retweeting. And if your tweets include hashtag SRA events, then they will be projected on the wall that's visible from the gallery space. Word about questions. As it is our largest ever conference, the space is rather larger than we've had before, so there are no roving microphones. The space is too big. We are using the Slido app. Please download it onto your smartphone if you haven't done already, and send in questions this way. You'll see from the programme that there are 2 breakout sessions. Please read the programme and decide which presentations you wish to see and which room they're in. The exception to this is the masterclasses. They are fully booked. Please check your delegate badge for a coloured sticker which tells you if you've got in. No sticker, no masterclass. But I know you're itching to get on with the day, and I'm very pleased to introduce our first keynote speaker, Sir John Curtice. Sir John is Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University in Glasgow and Senior Research Fellow at NatSen Social Research and the ESRC's The UK in a Changing Europe initiative. He's written extensively about voting behaviour in elections and referendums in the UK, as well as on British political and social attitudes more generally. He's been co-editor of NatSen's annual British Social Attitudes reports for over 20 years, and is a regular contributor to British and international media coverage of politics in the UK. He has been particularly in demand recently. Sir John is the chief commentator of 2 websites, whatscotlandthinks.org and whatukThinks.org.eu, that provide a comprehensive collection of materials on public attitudes towards how Scotland should be governed and the UK's relationship with the EU. He is a Fellow of the British Academy, the Royal Society of Edinburgh, and the Academy of the Social Sciences, and is an Honorary Fellow of the Royal Statistical Society. And he could hardly have produced a more timely keynote speech. So John will be talking on Should We Have Seen Brexit Coming? Lessons of the Last 40 Years of Social Research.
Thank you very much, Bev, for that very generous introduction. Yes, when we were planning this, I'm kind of a bit of a one-track mind at the moment. I'm funded by the ESRC to keep on researching into public attitudes towards Brexit. So if you want me to do a talk, I want to do something about Brexit. But the SRA said, but hang on, we want somebody who will also talk about 40 years worth of social research. So as you will discover, this is going to be a kind of marriage of these 2 things. And one consequence of this is I'm going to apply, as it were, a much longer lens to the subject than you will hear on the radio or the television at the moment, which you may or may not find interesting. Because, of course, there isn't, it's not exactly, but there's a kind of vague parallel to the history of Brexit and our membership of the European Union and the Social Research Association, because as you can see, the Social Research Association, 40 years old. Well, our membership of what was once called the Common Market is not much more than 43 years old, albeit maybe going to end next year. So in a sense, therefore, what I want to do is to say, well, what can we understand about how public attitudes towards the European Union have evolved during the course of the last 40 years. And along the way of doing that, I want to talk a little bit about some of the methods of social research that enable us to address those questions. Now, inevitably, there's a limitation to this. I have to fess up straight away. I'm primarily a quant researcher. So apologies to all those of you who want to talk about the exciting developments in qualitative research in the last 40 years. I'm afraid you'll have to talk about that amongst yourselves later on. But hopefully, at least, I will be able to demonstrate that there have indeed been interesting developments in social research methodology, at least on the quantitative side, during the course of the last 40 years. Now, one reason for asking the question, should we have seen it coming, is that the honest truth is, if you believe opinion polls, is that most people didn't see it coming. This is a bit of polling that was done, actually this is the average of some polling done by 4 polling companies just before the referendum itself, in which people were asked, what do you think the outcome is going to be? And as you can see, around half the public thought that Remain was going to win, and only a quarter or so thought that Leave were going to win. So certainly there are plenty of people out there who ended up being rather bemused on June the 24th, 2016, because they certainly didn't see it coming. Perhaps one reason why they didn't see it coming is that, of course, this was a referendum which divided our society very, very strongly demographically. So, for example, if you are young and you're a graduate, which will encompass a fair proportion of the people in this room, and you, for the most part, talk to young graduates, particularly if you live in this city, you might presume, of course, it was obvious that the Remain side were going to win. Well, of course, you were only talking to a very distinct section of British society, and there's another whole section of society out there of, how shall I put it, people who are older than I am, and actually people slightly younger than I am these days, and people who have few, if any, educational qualifications, whose view on the subject was very, very different. So, an obvious second question, therefore, to ask ourselves is, well, should this social division be apparent? So, two questions, therefore, I'm going to address. One is, should, if we had been intelligent social researchers, have said, no, actually, it's not obvious who's going to win this referendum, and that if we look at the history of public attitudes in the last 40 years, is that the conclusion to which we might reasonably have come? And then secondly, given the very stark divisions, some of which I've shown you, I'm going to show you some others later on, are those something that if we look at the social research evidence, or more strictly speaking, the survey research evidence of the last 40 years, that we again might have reasonably anticipated? And as I've already indicated along the way, I want to talk a little bit about how social research have evolved. Now, just in case anybody thinks I'm going to have a go at the polling industry and say, well, the reason why people thought that Remain side were going to win is that's what the polls told them, let me just disabuse you of that notion. If you take all of the published opinion polls that were conducted in the 4 official weeks of the campaign once we went into purdah at the back end of May 2016, actually there were slightly more opinion polls that had Leave ahead than Remain ahead. Why most people thought Remain were bound to win, I frankly do not understand. This was not the message of the opinion polling. Indeed, actually, in the week before the referendum, the opinion polls were almost all in a consensus that the Remain side were going to win. The truth is, actually, a lot of people were betting against the polls. A lot of people were saying, well, of course, we know what happens. We know that opinion polls actually tend to underestimate support for the status quo in major constitutional referendums. So therefore, actually, the polls will be wrong. So the judgment that many people were making was not a judgment based on what the polls were saying. It was based on a judgment of the way in which they thought the polls would be wrong. Well, actually, the polls weren't quite so wrong as they thought. Anyway, let me go back then to the first question. And I said the first kind of reason that perhaps we would not be surprised that this is a country whose membership of the European Union has frankly always been problematic during the course of the last 40 years is that we are not a country that feels European. Here's, again, is a question that comes from Eurobarometer, so this is the European Union's own data, and they've been asking a version of the Moreno question, which is a question that basically says, I'm British, not European, all the way to say I'm European, not British, and varieties in between. This is a bit of Spanish political science, which has become internationalized. And here is a little bit of international survey research, because these are figures for Britain, but these research is done by the European Union in all 27 countries. And one of the things that certainly has happened to survey research and social research in the last 40 years, it's become much more of an international enterprise. If you go back to the 1970s, at that point, there were not any systematic attempts, regular attempts, to undertake comparative international survey-based research. There are now many, many such enterprises, such as the European Social Survey, the International Social Survey, etc., and indeed also the work of the European Union. And Eurobarometer is also a creature of the 1970s. So that's one important way in which social and survey research has changed. But however, what hasn't changed is that basically around 2/3 of the British public, given the Moreno question, say not just that they are British, but they deny that they are European. So therefore the question, and insofar as people's willingness to adhere to political institutions is a function of regarding those political institutions as an expression of the society to which they think they belong and people with whom they share some sense of common social bond, the fact that most people in this country have never felt European has always meant that the European Union was capable of being portrayed as being other rather than us, and that therefore it was always possible to say, why do Brussels boss us about, in such a way as to suggest that this is potentially illegitimate. So that's arguably a fundamental failure of the European project in this country. There is only one other country at the moment that feels so un-European than the UK, and that is Greece. Everywhere else in the European Union, even Denmark, which at one stage was also tended to be very similar to the British in its outlook on identity, a clear majority of people feel European. So one absolutely fundamental feature of our attitudes, which has never really changed in 40 years of membership. Second reason, however, why we might say, we not be surprised, is that we do actually have some time series. This is from Ipsos Mori. Ipsos Mori, which the company itself is a creature of the late 1960s, but it from around 1977 or so has been asking exactly the same question about whether or not how people would vote in a referendum. So this really starts just after the 1975 referendum. And as you can see, for much of the 1980s, there was a clear majority view we should get out. Why did we vote to stay inside the European Union in 1975? We then get a turnaround in the late 1980s, and for a while, the European Union is the bee's knees, but it then starts to diminish in the 1990s. One event rarely mentioned in this story, but actually is quite important, was the banning of British beef because of the concerns about Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease in the early 1990s, and British beef is an icon of British society. We got into a position by the early years of the coalition that we again had a majority in favour of getting out in Mori's polls. It then switched in the other direction, and this becomes part of the other story about how there was a difference during the EU referendum between phone polls and internet polls. So, but again, another major contribution that social research now has is that we do have these long time series, and I'm going to use quite a few of them. But this is also an enterprise which reminds us also of how commercial polling research has changed, because the early Ipsos Mori surveys are face-to-face quota surveys. After about and there's a whole period between about 92 and 2008 when there's a mixture, but in 2008 onwards, these are random digit dialing telephone surveys. Clearly a major change in the methodology, and we spent a lot of time within the community arguing about the merits and demerits of the two approaches. But here again, so again, even though we've got this continuous effort which enable us to be able to chart and to appreciate the potential volatility of British attitudes, but that also certainly we've had historical time periods when we've been quite strongly in favour of getting out of the EU. This has been done through an emergent changing methodology, not least as a result of the increasing expense of interviewers, and B, the fact that we reached more or less universal telephone ownership in the late 1980s or so. But only then, it's relatively recent. There are then, however, if we want to understand the more recent period, we've then got the intense polling that comes, in this case, from YouGov. And this reminds us that, of course, of the other major revolution that's occurred in the whole area of survey research in recent years, which is the advent of the internet. YouGov really begins to take off with it at around the turn of this century. But again, should we have been surprised? No, because again, here's the same picture. In the early years of the coalition, there were clear majorities of the polls saying we should get out. Actually, ironically, Cameron's Bloomberg speech, it failed to prick the UKIP bubble, but actually it did help to narrow the lead in favour of getting out. And we reached a position where it was around 50-50. But anybody who was following the polls that were done by the internet all the way through from September 2015 onwards, when we knew what the question was going to be, would have known that we were looking at something that looked like a 50-50 shot. I, of course, as you've already gathered, have been involved with British social attitudes, so I'm going to use British social attitudes quite a lot. And again, here's another example of how we now have available to us, in this case, you know, what Natsen would argue is high quality social research, where the aim in this particular instance has indeed been to try to measure how the climate of British public opinion has changed over the long term, rather than the more short-term variations which commercial polling has hitherto at least tended to be has been its forte. And again, a reminder of how attitudes have changed. So this is a question that first appeared on the first British Social Attitude Survey back in 1983. And as you can see, at that point, only slightly more people said that we should continue to be members as opposed to saying that we should withdraw. It then moves out to position, as you've already seen from the Ipsos Mori data, by the late 1980s, we are fairly clear that we want to stay inside the European Union. But then again, the time series then, there's a hiccup in the time series. There's another series of questions on British social attitudes I'll show you. But as you can see, by the time we've got to the late 1990s, it's gone back to being a relatively contentious issue. And even on this long-term measure, certainly our willingness to say continue rather than withdraw is something closer to the 1980s than it was in the late 80s and early 1990s. The reason for the break in the British Social Attitudes time series is that British Social Attitudes around the early 1990s to ask a slightly more nuanced question, which enables people not just to say, do you want to be in or out, but everything from, yeah, I want to be out, all the way through to, why do we have a British government? Let's just have a European government and have a federal superstate. And you can see how those options are worded there. Now, the thing that emerges out of this, however, initially, I'll come back to more of this later on, is again how what I would call Euroscepticism very, very clearly became much more in evidence as this time series evolved over the last 25 years or so. Now, what I mean by Euroscepticism here is the proportion of people who either say, leave the European Union, or say, well, I suppose we should stay. Somebody keeps on telling me it's rather good for us, but frankly, it'd be nice if Brussels would boss us around rather less. Put the numbers for those two things together, and as you can see, whereas in the early 1990s, just before our attitudes towards Europe became much more critical, you only had around just over a third or so of the public whom you would define as Eurosceptic. That rises quite sharply. That's the post-Jakob-Creutzfeldt disease spike. But then, as you can see, by the time we've got to the era of the coalition government, we are much more sceptical. Now, the vast majority of those people there are what I would call Cameronians, i.e., well, I suppose we should stay in, but we want Brussels to be less powerful. But you can see how underlying our attitudes is basically a wish that, well, frankly, the less we have to do with Europe, the better. Now, so therefore, essentially, I think what we knew from the survey research, two crucial things. A, that there have been time points in which we have been saying, let's get out, and that we were relatively skeptical in the run-up to the referendum. And on some data, you could see why we might be wanting to vote in favour of getting out. And that secondly, this takes place against a backcloth of a country which doesn't feel European and therefore was potentially always likely to question its membership of the European Union. If there was ever any country of the European Union that was ever likely to leave, the United Kingdom, frankly, has always looked like the most likely candidate. Then into that mix comes clearly two crucial social developments, both of which the public notice. The first is, of course, the experience of migration. The UK historically is a country which has been a net exporter of population, and you can still see some of that in the data for the early 1990s. This is from the Migration Observatory. The red line in between the kind of purple and green ones is the level of net migration. Early 1990s, we are kind of, taking in and out in roughly equal numbers, and occasionally we're actually losing more people than gaining. And that has tended to be the UK's historical experience. It starts in the late 1990s, but then is given a further boost, ironically, by our decision to be more Europhile than virtually any other country of the European Union and to give the freedom of movement rights to the citizens of the A8 accession countries in 2004 when Poland, etc., joined the European Union. We were told they wouldn't want to come. Why would anybody want to come to this country with its miserable weather? The weather is so much better in continental Europe. And the Polish plumber became one of the stereotypes of our society. And then, of course, in 2010, we were told we were going to stop them from coming, but they still kept coming. Now, of course, it's not just to do with European Union migration, but the fact that the European Union freedom of movement rules means that at the end of the day, no country who is a member of the European Union can control the level of migration. And the success of UKIP in linking European Union membership with the fact that we're having high levels of migration, which some people found rather difficult, does provide a crucial contingent factor that helps to explain why we are. And do people notice? Yes, this is another of Ipsos Mori's wonderful time series every month or so. And this time series again goes back to 1974. It's even longer than this association. I'm just showing you here from the 1990s. It's the proportion of people who say that immigration is one of the most important issues facing the country. And yes, it may be true that some people who say it's the most important country say yes, and it's wonderful. But to be honest, most people who say that it's an important issue are not saying that. They're saying it's a problem. And as you can see how in the beginning of this century, concern about immigration rose, and then it rises even more strongly in the immediate run-up to the referendum. So we experience high levels of immigration, people notice, and people begin to at least question whether that's something that they want to experience. So that's certainly something that's very clear from our survey research. The second crucial backdrop, of course, is the financial crash of 2008 and the subsequent Eurozone crisis. Back in 1975, it was very, very easy to argue the economic case for the UK's membership of the then common market. It was the 6 original members of the European Union have experienced much higher levels of economic growth than of the UK, whose economy is widely regarded as the sick man of Europe. We need to join the European Union in order to benefit. By 2016, that argument was much more difficult to pursue. Some of the southern European countries, such as obviously Greece, but also Spain and Italy, were suffering, and their levels of GDP had still not recovered by the time of the referendum to what it had been before the financial crash. The UK took a hit, but it recovered relatively quickly. But there is enough there for the UK to say, well, hang on, actually, we've managed to weather the storm despite the fact that we were very exposed to international financial markets relatively well. Look at the mess that the European Union have made of it. And the truth is that the economic case for European Union membership was not regarded by the public as strong as it should be. Now, this isn't a brilliant question. This is, again, a question that's been on British Social Attitudes, which has said to people, what do you think would be the economic consequence of the UK having a stronger link with the European Union? I'm not quite sure why it was ever worded in that way. But as you can see, again, early 1990s, the high point of European Union membership, nearly a half is going to say, yeah, if it was even stronger, we'd be even better off. But that mood gradually dissipates. And that, again, it's clear that although, and you can see this in lots of commercial polling, more people think European Union membership is advantageous rather than disadvantageous, the figure or the proportion of people who think that European Union membership is clearly linked to economic benefit is well below 50%, and you have to win a referendum, you've got to get 50% to vote for you. So against that, with these contingent factors, and given the structural factors I've identified, this is why you can end up with what we ended up. And frankly, the result of the EU referendum is a little bit of mental arithmetic. So just to walk you through this, this is taking data from YouGov just before the referendum. This is looking at people's perceptions of the economic consequences of Brexit, taking out the don't knows. So 54% of people either thought that we would be better off leaving the European Union, or, and this is what lots of people said, it just won't make any difference. 46% thought we'd be worse off. So notice the proportion of people, even in this data, who thought we'd be worse off leaving the European Union is less than 50%. What I'm then showing you is the percent for each of these two rows. So the 13 there is the percentage of people who said that they thought the economic consequences of leaving the European Union would either be that we'd be better off, wouldn't make any difference. Only 13% of those people vote Remain. Underneath, if you thought we were going to be worse off, you were virtually guaranteed to vote to Remain. But it's only 46% of the population. You then, and then you've got the equivalent figures for Leave, and then you work out, so what basically is 87% of 54% of the population plus 5% of 46% of the population, and the answer is it's 49%. So you can see how we end up with a very close referendum. So it's not that people were voting against their economic perceptions, they were following their economic perceptions very, very strongly, but given the balance of economic perceptions and the fact that the European Union was no longer regarded as an unalloyed economic success, creates the circumstances in which we could get a very close referendum outcome. Here's the same calculation on immigration. I won't go through the detail, but essentially the story is the same. Actually, the link between people's attitudes towards immigration and how they voted is weaker than the link with the economy. Only 75% of those people who thought that immigration would fall as a result of leaving the European Union actually voted to leave. Some people voted Remain despite rather than because of what they thought the immigration consequences would be. But if you don't again do the arithmetic, you end up with 51% for Leave. So both the economic issue and the economic issue, these two contingent issues, point us to an even division. So should we have been surprised at the overall outcome? Frankly, no. What about relationships? What about who did and didn't vote for Remain and Leave? Should we have been surprised about that? Well, one of the things, of course, that is true, and it's why the House of Commons is frankly in a royal kerfuffle, and why both the Conservative and the Labour parties are seriously divided over the subject, is that the parties were unable to take their voters with them in the EU referendum, with one exception. Now, you might laugh, but I can tell you that in I've kind of almost done 40 years worth of survey research. I'm almost as old as the organisation. Hitherto, I have never, ever been able to put up a slide in which I've been able to say every single person in my survey who had a certain set of characteristics voted a particular way. Usually the number is 97, and when you get to the Q&A, some bright spot spots up and say, how do you explain the 3% of people who voted, who say they're UKIP members and who voted to Remain? And you kind of go, look, survey error, and they look at you bemused. So you avoided that embarrassment this morning. But I mean, the crucial point, of course, is both the Conservative and Labour parties were very starkly divided, as were Democrats. But of course, what is also true, note that the Conservative Party, a majority of its people voted to leave. The Labour Party voted by about 2-1 in favour of Remain. Is this something that we could have anticipated? Well, this is something, and here it's important to remind ourselves, this is something where the politics of the EU are now very, very different from what they were back when we can first measure this in the 1980s. Remember, in 1983, the Labour Party stood on a manifesto that said we should get out of the European Union. Indeed, remember that the referendum that we had in 1975 was held because the Labour Party was internally divided over the EU, and that Tony Benn and Peter Shaw, etc., wanted us to leave. And that's why we had a referendum. That's indeed why cabinet collective responsibility was dispensed with, and indeed the Labour Party divided. Sound familiar? Yes, it's exactly what David Cameron had to do. It was a complete replication of history except for the end of the story. But that therefore, in the 1980s, Labour voters were inclined to get out of the European Union, whereas Conservatives thought it was a brilliant capitalist enterprise. It changes, and of course the crucial change was Jacques Delors persuading the Labour movement in the late 1980s. Look, you can't get any decent labour market legislation out of the UK government, but the European Union you might have some success with, and so the attitude of the Labour movement changes. Because we've now got this very different situation, whereas it's a Conservative electorate that is more pro-leave. So that's one thing we couldn't have anticipated. But what about some of the other things? Well, what about, for example, the age gap I showed you earlier? Well, if you go back to the first British social attitudes, that's more difficult to see. There isn't that much of an age relationship. But that thereafter, as you can see throughout, it's always been the case that younger people have been less keen on withdrawing from the European Union than have older people. Although that said, clearly the division became sharper as the overall level of support for leaving the European Union became greater during the years of the coalition. So that's something that probably we could live with. But of course, it's an important reminder, because there are a lot of people out there kind of calculating, so how long will it take for all those old folks to die off? And we can stay inside the EU. Well, it was the generation of people who voted to leave, who voted to remain back in 1975, and we should not necessarily assume that that today's younger people will necessarily remain as strongly EU as they are at present. What about the educational divide? Well, that's always been there. Graduates have always been less keen on withdrawing than are those with no qualifications, and that's true even though, as obviously, the character of the graduate population has changed over time. That said, and the figures here on the right-hand side are the figures to what actually happened in the referendum. It's also clear, however, that this social division became even starker in the run-up and as a consequence of the referendum. So the division was always there, and we can doubtless think of reasons as to why it exists, but it becomes starker in the referendum. So we could have anticipated, yes. Would it have been that big? Well, that's more doubtful. There's another division, however, which I've not referred to, which I think it's also you need to understand in order to understand what was going on in this referendum, and where, again, you can see how the referendum actually polarized British society. Now, again, this is one of the other kind of long bits of social research. Back in the early 1980s, I and the late Sir Roger Jow and Anthony Heath, we did some work in trying to say, how can we measure some of the central values that seem to be central to our society and people's how people address particular policy issues, and indeed the way in which they vote. One of them was to do with left and right, but the other was to do with what we called liberals or authoritarians, we might want to call social liberals and social conservatives. To cut a long story short, there's a set of items, Likert scale items, which you will see on British social attitudes every year, and now you'll find them on other surveys as well. You'll find them on Understanding Society, you'll find them on the British Election Study, which were designed to say, well, look, if you're a social liberal, you are somebody who essentially says, look, at the end of the day, what social mores you follow, what social practices you adhere to, what symbols you respect, what religion you practice, etc., what moral code you follow is up to you. In contrast, if you're a social conservative, you say, no, hang on, that all sounds wonderful, but if we are going to cohere a society, we do need, to some extent, a common moral code. We do need people speaking the same language. We do need people accepting certain common symbols, etc., and have some common sense of identity. And it's that division between social liberals and social conservatives that is very much the value division in the referendum. So here, for example, is showing you how Social liberals, are now around 80% of them voted to remain, whereas around 3/4 of social conservatives voted to leave. And this is the crucial value division. It was not a division between left and right. Left-wingers were as likely to vote leave as were right-wingers. This is a division about a different dimension, about social liberalism versus social conservatism, not least, of course, because of the importance of the immigration issue. This is a division which was again always there. You can see it in the British Social Attitudes Time series. Those of a more authoritarian or socially conservative disposition have always been more inclined to want withdrawal, and to that extent, this pattern predates the row about immigration. But you can also see, however, if we compare what happened in 2016 with the continued withdrawal division in 2015, it looks as though the division was widened. And again, if we do the same analysis using that more nuanced question and just looking at the percentage of people who said they would withdraw, well, again, by 2013, it's clearly become a greater division, and by this stage, immigration has become something of an issue. So immigration has probably helped to fuel an existing division, but again, it very clearly became sharper in the referendum. So the answer is, therefore, the polarization of the referendum was always, as it were, the pattern has long been there for the most part, with the exception of the party politics. But almost undoubtedly, the referendum helped to increase the polarization, certainly with respect to people's values, and also to some degree, probably with respect to education. Okay, very briefly, one other thing, much more short term, just again to remind us of another way in which social research has changed, and where we should be aware that what we think is a golden truth underpinned by 40 years of research can be overturned very quickly. This is data from NatSen's mixed mode random probability survey. So methodologically, a reminder of another innovation. I've already talked about the internet earlier, but we're now also beginning to use the internet not only to do what we might want to regard as, acquired samples, but samples where actually you are trying to use a random probability method in order to acquire respondents. And using not only the internet, but also the telephone to improve the quality of the sample. So this is data that comes from that. So again, of course, the advantage of this approach is that whereas a big annual survey is great for getting the climate, it's lousy for looking at short-term dynamics of the kinds that clearly we might want to ask about Brexit. But why have I put this slide up in particular? Well, one of the things that we thought we knew about British society is that we were no longer passionate about our politics. And one of the longest standing in my kind of trade of electoral studies is that the proportion of people who have a strong sense of what we call party identification, which is essentially a strong affective attachment, such that you say, I'm Conservative, I'm Labour, I'm a Liberal Democrat, this has been long-term decline. And indeed, here you can see the most recent figures from the NatSen survey. Only 10% of people call themselves a very strong Conservative or very strong Labour. Well, what I did on this survey was to add almost exactly the same sequence of questions that we used to ask about party ID to ask people about whether they were a Remainer or a Leaver. 2/5 of people called themselves a very strong Remainer and a very strong Leaver. This is an issue in which, and it's not just Leavers, it's Remainers and Leavers have a strong emotional, affective attachment. Emotion is back in British politics. A lot of people in my profession were bemoaning its decline for years. They're now wondering whether what they wished for was desirable or not. But it is a remarkable change. It's a reminder of how things can be different, but again, how the polarization is underpinned by emotion. You might then, however, be wondering, so what do we now think now? Well, I'm not going to go into the details of that. Simply really just to give you a health warning about the fact that we do have survey research that for the most part says that now slightly more of us would vote Remain than would vote Leave. As you can see, now this is actually the strongest evidence that there's been a bit of a turnover, but it's not that much of a turnover. 90% of Remain voters would still vote the same way. Even amongst Leave voters, and this is a relatively low figure as compared with some other surveys, it is 80%. Slightly more Remain voters Leave voters going to Remain rather than vice versa, but there's not that much turnover. Most people have not changed their minds, despite the arguments of the last 2 years. The group that is potentially crucial are those who did not vote 2 years ago, who have always, from the very beginning, again showing a whole series of nuts and panel surveys. So even shortly after the referendum, this group was slightly more Remain than Leave, but it has gradually become, certainly by year on, markedly more Remain than Leave. But of course, the question is, would they turn out to vote? Anyway, that's just an example of how the short-term dynamics we can now do methodologically. I'm not going to say all of that, but I hope to convince you of two things. Yep, have social research methods moved on, been enhanced, taken the opportunities of technological change and changes in telephone ownership, etc.? Yes. Should we have been surprised? No. We've always been problematic members of the European Union. And can the social research record of the last 40 years help us to understand why that was the case, and why in the end we ended up with where we were, and why we're now arguing about it now? I think also we can reasonably claim that we can enlighten our society about how it has ended up where it is. How it gets from where it is now to where it might want to be in 12 months' time is perhaps a much more difficult question to answer, but at least hopefully we can enable people to understand the history of how we got there.
Thank you so much, John, for what I'm sure everybody agrees is an absolutely fascinating presentation. You won't be surprised to learn that the questions and comments are coming in thick and fast. Mm-hmm. We've got somebody asking, is it possible that by continually asking if we want to leave or remain and publishing the results, that's brought the question to the forefront of people's minds and helped sort of develop?
Well, I mean, it's no secret that the People's Vote campaign have been using polling research very effectively, despite the fact that some of us on the sidelines have been kind of questioning some of what they've been doing, as a way of trying to develop momentum for the idea of a second referendum. Undoubtedly crucial, and it's undoubtedly also true that the Remain side have been much better financed in this battle than have those on the other side of the fence. There's much less polling been sponsored by that side. They've used polling research to work out their message. So why is it called the People's Vote? That is the product of survey research. They did some quite interesting comparative research, and they discovered fairly early on, and it's still there in the polling evidence. If you ask people whether or not they want another referendum, they go, "Oh God, no, we don't want another one of those, thank you very much." Ask people whether or not the public should have the final say on the deal in a people's vote, people go, "Well, of course we should have the final say." Right? So the crucial thing, so therefore the wording it matters, but that helps with how they frame them. So polling has certainly framed the message. It's a classic case of communications research. But the second thing that the People's Vote do, which I think is somewhat naughty, is they very rarely specify what would be the options on the ballot paper. And the second thing we know from the fact that there's been lots of research is if you include in the survey question that the choice is going to be between Remain and leaving in some way or another, the level of support for the idea diminishes. So yes, it's certainly the People's Vote campaign use of research and kind of arguing when, frankly, if I were to put up a chart about what... It's actually very difficult to put a chart in terms of how attitudes towards the second referendum have evolved over time, because they keep on asking a slightly different question every time, and I kind of go, "Oh, would somebody just keep on asking the same question, please?" But, I mean, there's some evidence there's been a bit of a movement. But actually, if you were kind of to take a robust approach to it, you would not be arguing that certainly in the last 6 or 8 months there's been any movement in favour of a second EU referendum. But at the end of the day, frankly, it's a Remain project, and it's designed to try to reverse the outcome. Though, of course, it does have the irony that it is Caroline Lucas who is keenest on rescuing Theresa May from the inevitable defeat that she seems to be facing for a de Ville in the House of Commons. There is a wonderful paradox about the People's Vote campaign.
Thank you. Is there any evidence that policymakers are informed about these trends and that they use longitudinal research to inform their policies?
I have to admit, I'm a fair old skeptic about this, and this is largely because I'm battle-hardened by the experience of British social attitudes in the 1990s, not so much about Brexit, but about other things. For much of the 1990s, British social attitudes was constantly saying, you know what, the public are becoming increasingly concerned about the state of their public services and they're willing to pay more taxes to do it. The Labour Party manifestly refused to believe this message. They said the 1992 election demonstrates that people aren't vote for it and they're fibbing and giving you socially acceptable answers. Well, eventually the Labour Party, after about 2 years being in office, discovered that actually people were more concerned about public services and completely did a volte-face, and they eventually got the message. Of course, the irony is, as British socialists can also tell you, is that once you turn the spending taps on, people go, hang on, that's enough, thanks very much, you can stop now. But anyway, yes and no. Certainly, officials are perfectly well aware of. To be honest, what I've just given you this morning is kind of a bit academic. If I'm talking to officials, I wouldn't give them, this lecture would be much more about the much more short-term phenomenon. But, for example, one group of people who we certainly I think this research has been helpful for is if you were talking to relatively young members of European diplomatic missions. You might imagine I did a lot of talks to diplomatic missions in London and indeed in Edinburgh from European countries, and most of these being young people who are well educated, used to living in a globalised world. Say, why the devil is anybody voting to leave the European Union? And you kind of had to sit them down and explain to them, and you could use survey research to explain to them the mindset of those who come from very different social and educational background than you as to why they might have a different perspective. And hopefully, therefore, along the way, enabled the European Union side of the negotiations to appreciate what was going on. But yes, then equally also. The answer is awareness, yes, but of course it doesn't. Evidence about survey research doesn't wholly drive things. The honest truth is, for example, the Labour Party is desperately trying to avoid the messages of the survey research, which at the end of the day, when it comes down, push comes to shove, and it has to choose where it stands, it almost undoubtedly is going to have to come out in favour of remaining. It's deliberately avoiding making that decision for perfectly understandable political reasons.
Excellent. Linking your two main research interests. We've got a question from Luke. Much of the discussion in Scotland has centred on how every constituency voted, however marginally, to remain. Have you any thoughts on that?
So on what?
On how every constituency in Scotland voted to remain. Have you any thoughts?
Yes, okay. Why did Scotland vote to remain? Well, indeed, why did Northern Ireland vote to remain? The crucial thing here is that whereas in England and in Wales, the question of sovereignty, which I didn't talk a great deal about, sovereignty is very difficult to do in survey research. If anybody's got any bright ideas to try, do let me know. I've had it go in different various ways. It's difficult to get at, but insofar as the question is, but I've kind of suggested the identity question where sovereignty kicks in. Insofar as sovereignty is a key issue, and that therefore in England and in Wales, the argument was, we don't feel European, therefore why are we being governed by Brussels? It is a limitation on our sovereignty. Because since around 1990 or so, the Scottish National Party has been promulgating independence in Europe, membership of the European Union has been seen as a way of achieving independence rather than a barrier. So it's being able to exercise sovereignty. And of course, the same is true for the nationalist movement in Northern Ireland. The European Union has become associated with at least providing some of the things that you would get if you were to have a united Ireland. So the sovereignty issue gets framed differently. And the divisions are there in Scotland. It's older people, younger people, graduates, non-graduates. The value division is there, but it's variation around a different mean. And that therefore, in particular, people who, if south of the border, you kind of, I ain't going to make any difference economically. You voted leave. North of the border, that wasn't necessarily the case. So the SNP's framing of the question takes Scotland into a more remainder. But don't mistake it. Don't mistake it for Scotland being markedly more pro-European. It was a vote for independence, not a vote for the European Union.
Thank you. We could discuss this all day. I've got so many questions on this thing, but we do need to move on with the agenda, and I believe that the BBC are very keen to talk to you as well. So could we have a final round of applause for Professor Sir John Curtice?